Kyle Kuzma and Khris Middleton have been traded. Middleton and AJ Johnson are headed to Washington in exchange for Kyle Kuzma with some other draft assets involved as well. This is a super interesting trade that I'm sure a lot of people are confused by, so let's break it down. Now, the trade rumors around this deal have been swirling for the last couple of days. It seemed like people were pretty confident that something surrounding Middleton to Washington, Kuzma to Milwaukee was going to happen, and Milwaukee has been shopping Middleton specifically pretty aggressively over the last couple of weeks. He hasn't had a great season. He's been injured most of the year. He's really had injury issues the last couple of seasons, and it was clear that Milwaukee was ready, just like when they traded away Jrue Holiday. They were ready to move on from Khris Middleton and shake things up with their roster. Initially, there were some constructions that made it look like they might end up with Bradley Beal in some kind of crazy Jimmy Butler trade. That hasn't happened. They end up with Kyle Kuzma instead, and we know that the Wizards have been wanting to dump Kyle Kuzma for a couple of seasons. They signed him to a new contract, but that was just so that they wouldn't lose the asset. And in the past, there have been rumors that they could get one, maybe two first-round picks in exchange for Kuzma. We know that Sacramento is a team that has really valued him in the past, but this year, his value has gone down pretty significantly. So, of course, Washington does not end up with that level of draft compensation. But the question is, why would Milwaukee do this? Why would each of these teams do this, beginning with Milwaukee? As I mentioned, Middleton's health has been a problem, and their entire roster is getting old. Obviously, you have Lopez, you have Dame, you have Middleton. There's a bunch of guys in this roster that are getting older, getting worse, and getting more injury prone. And Middleton specifically was just a guy that Milwaukee didn't feel like they could count on moving forward, and he's likely just going to get worse and even more injury prone. So they're ready to move on and get another player in their rotation. Kuzma helps them defensively if he commits to it. I'd still probably rather have Khris Middleton overall, but in theory, Kuzma is a better defensive fit with this roster, although he's been in Washington for a couple years, so defense might be optional in his head at this moment. And even though it seems like Giannis is excited to have Kuzma, it seems like there was a vote of confidence from him for them to go out and make this move. I personally would be nervous if I was a Bucks fan about Kuzma's commitment to championship basketball, despite the fact that obviously he won a title with the Lakers in 2020. The last couple of years in Washington have not done him any favors on the defensive end of the floor, so that would make me nervous, but in theory, that's the mindset. It also, importantly, and potentially the most important part of this deal for Milwaukee, is that it gives them financial flexibility. They save about $8 million in the deal, and it gets them under the second apron, which means that they can now aggregate some salaries together. They can trade Pat Connaughton and Bobby Portis in the same deal. They can trade Brook Lopez and someone else. They can put salaries together. They're so much more flexible over the next 28 to 30 hours, depending on when you're watching this, as the trade deadline approaches. So this deal kind of can't be graded on its own, because you also have to account for what it could potentially allow for Milwaukee to do over the next day and a half. It's something we've speculated on in previous videos, where maybe Khris Middleton, maybe Pat Connaughton, there were going to be some other guys that could potentially be moved here from Milwaukee so that they could get under the second apron, and that has now happened. As I mentioned, I think Bobby Portis is a guy to keep an eye on as someone potentially on the move, because Kuzma gives them more options at the 4 now, alongside Giannis at the 5 or Lopez out there. They just have more options in the front court, which potentially makes someone like Bobby Portis redundant and expendable, and someone they could possibly trade out in a move later on. The bottom line for Milwaukee is they get younger, they get more flexible salary-wise, and Kuzma's under contract for under $20 million for the next couple of years, so that is a cost-controlled asset. They don't have to worry about trying to re-sign Khris Middleton. They don't have to worry about bringing in someone on the same contract level as him. They know they have Kuzma, and they know that he's on, relatively speaking, a good deal moving forward, and so they're fine making this deal. On the other hand, for Washington, this is all about assets, and any kind of Kyle Kuzma trade, and potentially someone like Jonas Valanciunas coming up, potentially be traded for Washington as well. Everything they're doing right now is about collecting assets. They're one of the worst teams in the league. They're trying to trade away any veteran players they have to continue to build and rebuild this team moving forward. So they get AJ Johnson, who is an asset that there are plenty of Bucks fans that really like him. They like his potential. He's still just 20 years old. He's a former first-round pick, crazy athlete. He is someone that could potentially grow into something in Washington. I'd imagine they see him as a real, legit asset. Still a ton of stuff to improve. He's still super young, but someone that could be good for them moving forward. It was also becoming pretty clear that Kuzma was becoming a problem in Washington. There's a bunch of problems in Washington, but Kuzma maybe wasn't the most professional player of all time, and someone that they were just ready to move on from. They've been ready to move on from him for a while. They probably waited too long to make this trade. Could have gotten more from him a year or two ago, but they decided that now was the time, and they were just ready to be out of the Kyle Kuzma business. Quite frankly, I can't blame them. Also, Khris Middleton has a player option this offseason, so even if he accepts that, which I'd imagine that he would, his contract is a year less than Kuzma's, which gives them more financial flexibility in the long term, despite the fact that it helps Milwaukee this year from a salary salary perspective, it helps Washington get out of that money a year earlier than had they just kept Kuzma on the books. And again, that is assuming that Khris Middleton picks up his player option. I'm assuming he will because it's worth like $34 million, and I don't see a team out there that's going to give him that, certainly not on a long-term deal. Still possible that he declines it, but for right now, Washington, even if he picks that up, gets out of a year of the Kuzma contract. And if Khris Middleton does stay, that's a professional you can have on the team that these young guys can learn from, and as much as that might seem cliche, in Washington, that actually probably matters quite a bit at the moment. Now, Middleton can still be moved to a third team before the deadline if they don't finalize the trade. A lot of times, trades this close to the deadline, they get announced, but they're not actually finalized. You can rope some other teams in, potentially maybe fold them into some other deals. Now, obviously, that could potentially hold up Milwaukee if they want to make some other deals, but I wouldn't be surprised if there's a team out there that sees that Khris Middleton is available and they go out and they give up some assets in order to get him from Washington, in which case Washington would likely get some expirings, maybe a pick, and then all of a sudden the deal makes a little bit more sense for them because they get more assets and they don't just have Khris Middleton sitting around on the roster. In terms of my own personal grades, for Milwaukee, I'm going to give this a B, maybe a B minus, depending on how pessimistic you are about Kuzma. I understand wanting to get rid of Khris Middleton. I understand the financial flexibility, but from a basketball perspective, I'd probably rather just have Khris Middleton at this point, even with the injury issues, even with how old he is. Unless there's some other massive move coming here, I don't see how this helps them from a basketball perspective. And Kuzma just makes me nervous, even if it helps some of their lineups. Again, this grade could change if this opens up some flexibility for them to make some other moves as the deadline approaches. For Washington, I'm going to give them an A here. It's a little bit of a weird trade. I'm sure a lot of people are confused as to why Khris Middleton is going to the Wizards in the first place, but AJ Johnson could be something. Middleton could be some assets for them this year in the offseason or next trade deadline, and they're just out of the Kyle Kuzma business, which I think is a positive for their young team as they're trying to continue to grow and develop. Like I said, you can give them a lower grade if you want to because of the fact that they should have moved Kuzma earlier, but at this point, at this trade deadline, this is probably about as good as it got for them in exchange for Kuzma. So some things to keep an eye on as the deadline approaches. Milwaukee can now put a bunch of different contracts together. We're assuming that Dame is going to stay. We're assuming that Giannis is going to stay, even post-Luka trade where everything's possible. We're expecting those two guys to still be on the team post-deadline. Everybody else is probably on the table. If they get a deal that they like, where they put together the Portis and the Connaughton contracts and they go and get somebody, maybe trade some other picks, whatever the case may be, that is still an option for them. They do still have some future assets. That is something to keep an eye on for Milwaukee, which again can change the grade for this particular deal pretty significantly. Meanwhile, for Washington, you're just trying to see if maybe they can find a third team for Khris Middleton to go to as part of this trade before it gets finalized. Think when the Bucks ended up trading Damian Lillard, or trading for Damian Lillard, Jrue Holiday went to Portland. Portland then later on found more assets in exchange for Jrue Holiday. Obviously a much lower caliber deal, but a similar concept, which just means pay attention to when the trade actually gets finalized, when these guys get announced with their new teams. That means if you're seeing it on socials, you're seeing it on Twitter that Kyle Kuzma is a member of the Milwaukee Bucks, that most likely means that it's been called into the league and the trade has been finalized, which means not only can Washington not send Khris Middleton out to a new team, so you have to wait 6 months after trading for a guy once it's finalized, but also that means Milwaukee can make some moves now that they're under the first apron, under the second apron, now that the trade is fully finalized. Those are some things to keep an eye on. Super interesting trade, but I wouldn't blame you if you're a little confused, and now we just wait for some more deals.